The trial of the Chicago 7 was a landmark moment in the 1960s counterculture and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Aaron Sorkin even made a movie about it, 2020's The Trial of the Chicago 7. And you only get the Sorkin treatment if you're a pretty big deal. But what was the real story? Today, we're looking at the real story of the trial of the Chicago 7. But before we get started, why not subscribe to the Weird History channel and leave a comment letting us know what other based on a true stories you'd like to hear about. Hope you've got yourself a long hallway, because it's time to walk and talk. First of all, it wasn't actually 7 people in the so-called Chicago 7. It was an elite 8 of activists, writers, and political organizers who were outspokenly against the Vietnam War. But they weren't part of any single cohesive group, and didn't even necessarily know each other. David Dellinger was a conscientious objector to World War II and the leader of the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, a group that also called themselves the MOB, which isn't quite an acronym, but close enough. Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis were members of the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, a nationwide student activist group dedicated to principles associated with what was then called the New Left. This included feminism, gay rights, support for socialist economic policies, and, of course, a rejection of the Vietnam War. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were leaders of the Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies. Politically, they were largely aligned with the SDS, but opted for more radical, theatrical, and public actions, like smoke-ins to protest the criminalization of marijuana, street theater, or elaborate pranks. The Yippies also favored food co-ops, free clinics, artist collectives, and public access television. Meanwhile, Weiner and John Froines were authors and academics, while Bobby Seale was a founding member of the Black Panther Party. The 1968 Democratic National Convention, which took place in the immediate aftermath of the assassinations of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. and Democratic political candidate Robert F. Kennedy, brought these 8 disparate men together. Originally, Senator Eugene McCarthy had challenged incumbent President Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination. When Bobby Kennedy jumped into the race, Johnson announced that he no longer planned to seek the party's nomination and that he would stop bombing North Vietnam and seek peace talks before the end of his presidency. This set up a showdown between McCarthy and Kennedy, with Vice President Hubert Humphrey also entering the race but declining to participate in any primary votes. Then Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson's peace talks stalled, setting off total chaos within the party. McCarthy had campaigned largely on an anti-war message, while Humphrey was seen as continuing the Johnson administration's strategy. Meanwhile, some of Bobby Kennedy's supporters were switching over to another senator, South Dakota's George McGovern. Maybe they were just really into senators. All of this attention and scrutiny made the 1968 Democratic Convention, held in Chicago between August 26th and 29th, a lightning rod for protests and public actions. City administrators attempted to minimize the impact and visibility of the protests by rejecting many permits from activist groups, denying, for example, any marches in areas with majority black populations, and instituting a curfew in public spaces. Meanwhile, Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley assured the public that law and order will be maintained, and beefed up the city's police and security forces with mace and riot helmets in addition to their usual guns and billy clubs. Thousands of protesters made their way to Chicago, and the week of the convention saw a number of violent confrontations. Early in the morning of August 22nd, Chicago police officers stopped 17-year-old Dean Johnson on the street for a curfew violation. When Johnson pulled out a pistol and it misfired, the officers shot back, fatally wounding him. Elsewhere, while a Lincoln Park music festival had been planned by the Yippies, that's Lincoln Park, the Chicago neighborhood, not the new metal band, the police arrived to shut things down. As confusion spread and Yippie frontman Abbie Hoffman told the crowd that the festival had been stopped by the police, the scene turned tense and eventually violent. A number of protesters, along with journalists and photographers covering the event, were clubbed and beaten by police. Violent clashes continued in Grant Park through Monday, while a skirmish between Chicago cops and protesters from the Poor People's Campaign on Michigan Avenue turned into what the Chicago Sun-Times called a 17-minute melee in front of the Conrad Hilton. Much of the incident was captured by TV cameras as protesters shouted, "The whole world is watching." 100 protesters and 119 police officers were treated for injuries following the clash, and the police arrested over 600 protesters. That same night, Vice President Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic nomination for president. If you just said Hubert Humphrey, that pretty well sums him up as a presidential candidate. Following the convention, investigations into the causes of violence were pursued by a number of federal government agencies. Mayor Daley's administration, meanwhile, blamed it on outside agitators who purposefully sought a hostile confrontation with police. Initially, the U.S. Department of Justice opted not to prosecute any demonstrators. President Johnson's Attorney General Ramsey Clark suggested instead that the U.S. Attorney in Chicago investigate the Chicago police for their role in sparking the conflicts. The National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence reached a similar conclusion, referring to the event as a police riot, while stating that the vast majority of demonstrators were expressing themselves peacefully. By the end of the year, Republican Richard Nixon had won the presidency. 2 months after his inauguration, Nixon's Justice Department opted to indict 8 organizers of the Chicago demonstrations under a recently passed statute known as the Anti-Riot Act. Passed in reaction to the so-called race riots of 1964 through 1967, the act was an attempt by legislators to make it easier to prosecute protesters, so long as they were Daley's outside agitators who did not live in the community that hosted the protest. The Chicago 8 were the first defendants ever indicted under the law, which had only been passed in April of that year. They were charged with conspiring to use interstate commerce with intent to start a riot. Dellinger, Davis, Hayden, Hoffman, Rubin, and Seale were all specifically charged with crossing state lines for protests, while Froines and Weiner were additionally prosecuted for teaching demonstrators how to construct incendiary devices, despite the fact that the devices in question were relatively harmless stink bombs. Sort of like getting prosecuted for your senior prank, which some of us probably did. The trial began on September 24, 1969, under presiding Judge Julius Hoffman. Defendant Abbie Hoffman, who, big surprise, was not related to the judge, signaled almost immediately that he would be a disruptive presence. When he was mentioned during Prosecutor Richard Schultz's opening statement, he stood up and blew a kiss to the jury. While testifying under oath, Hoffman gave the judge the finger and refused to answer questions directly, even from his own attorney. When asked where he lived, he responded, "Woodstock Nation." Jerry Rubin was also an irritating presence for the judge, at times greeting him with a Zig Heil. One day during the trial, both Hoffman and Rubin showed up to court wearing their own judge's robes. When ordered to remove them, they revealed Chicago police uniforms underneath. Not every challenge to the court's authority was quite as Bugs Bunny. Defendant Bobby Seale argued that he should not be grouped with his fellow defendants, and pointed out that he had only spent a few hours in Chicago before the violence started. It was widely believed that the government had lumped Seale in with the rest of the Chicago protesters in the hopes of reading text from his old speeches to the jury to make them all appear dangerous radicals. Seale also protested the fact that he didn't have an attorney present at the opening of the trial, as his lawyer, Charles Gary, had been hospitalized for emergency surgery. Judge Hoffman not only denied Seale's request for a delay, but wouldn't allow Seale to represent himself or cross-examine witnesses. It was functionally the same as denying him an attorney during this period. Seale responded by declaring the judge a racist and a, quote, fascist dog, prompting Judge Hoffman to have him chained to his seat and physically gagged in the courtroom. This went on for 3 days, with Seale physically struggling to escape his bonds and insisting on his right to defend himself, at which point defense attorney William Kunstler accused Judge Hoffman of operating a medieval torture chamber. On November 5th, the judge declared a mistrial for Seale, severing his case for a later trial that never happened, and downgrading the Chicago 8 into the Chicago 7. Judge Hoffman also sentenced Seale to 4 years in prison on 16 counts of contempt of court. The trial stretched on for months, involving more than 100 witnesses, including notable members of the counterculture movement like folk singer Arlo Guthrie, comedian Dick Gregory, author Norman Mailer, poet Allen Ginsberg, and LSD advocate Timothy Leary. Who doesn't want that guy's endorsement? Finally, on February 14th, Judge Hoffman sent the case to the jury, and a verdict was returned on February 18th. The jury acquitted all 7 defendants on the conspiracy charges, and also threw out the stink bomb charges against Froines and Weiner. Threw them out like a couple of stink bombs. The jury did, however, find Davis, Dellinger, Hayden, Hoffman, and Rubin guilty of traveling across state lines with the aim of inciting a riot. During sentencing, several defendants made statements, with Davis pointedly telling Judge Hoffman, "You represent all that is old, ugly, bigoted, and repressive in this country, and I will tell you that the spirit of this defense table will devour your sickness in the next generation." The judge sentenced each defendant to 5 years in prison on the riot charges, along with a $5,000 fine and the costs of prosecution. Hoffman also charged each of the defendants, and most of their attorneys, with contempt at various points during the proceedings. Sentences on a total of 159 counts of criminal contempt included 29 months and 16 days for Dellinger, 25 months and 14 days for Davis, and over 48 months for defense attorney William Kunstler. Yep, he gave the lawyer 4 years. In May of 1972, the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit dismissed nearly all of the contempt charges before reversing the criminal charges in November as well, including Bobby Seale's 4-year sentence. The appeals court cited a number of errors by Judge Hoffman and the prosecutors during the trial, but also found that even without these errors, Hoffman's demeanor would have been grounds for a reversal. And in 1973, the Department of Justice announced that it had no plans to retry the case. However, overly sentimental film adaptations of the trial were still fair game, and that's how you get an Aaron Sorkin. So what do you think? How close was the movie to the real-life case? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from Our Weird History.